much about being for our community, for folks who maybe you wrote on that card. Thank you, Nolan. Appreciate it. He'd love to play my whole sermon. So we're going to talk today about a guy named Peter, okay? So we're going to talk about a guy named Peter. Way back when, about 10 to 15 years after the resurrection, people had already become sort of hardwired as to what it meant to be a Christian, what it meant to be a person of faith, okay? And you and I, maybe if you grew up in the church, some of us did, some of us didn't, but if you grew up in the church, I'm guessing likely early on you got sort of hardwired as to what Christians look like, act like, what they're supposed to be like. For example, in our house, I've used this example before, in our house, my mom had Sunday clothes for us, right? Sunday clothes, raise your hand if you had Sunday duds, right? And you'd hang them up after church, you'd leave them there till the next Sunday, and boy, you better not get grass stains on them. Because we were taught that if you're a good Christian, you wore on Sunday your Sunday best, right? We also, in the church I grew up in, we sort of learned that if you're going to be a good Christian, you give a certain percentage of your income away. And that percentage, you were supposed to give a certain percentage, 10% of your income is what we were taught growing up. And you know what? In the church I grew up in, they actually put a list of what everybody in the church gave right by the church door. Huh? Imagine that. We're not ever going to do that, don't worry, right? There were certain things we were taught. We were taught that kids were to be seen and not heard in church. And I remember so many times my mom poking me. My dad was a preacher, and she'd poke me and she'd say, "You just wait till your dad gets home," right? There were these certain lessons that we learned about what church people look like and what they're supposed to act like and how they're supposed to be. Well, for this guy named Peter, it was the very same. 10 to 15 years after the resurrection, Jesus has already risen. The church has already started to sort of codify what it looks like to be a Christian. And Peter was much the same. He was one of the disciples, the first disciples Jesus chose. And he had this understanding of what a good Christian is supposed to look like. And it was this very slim definition, if I do say so. You see, Peter was like many of those former Jews who had become Christians, and he had this belief, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, he had this belief, like many of those Jewish Christians, that in order to become a Christian, you had to first become a Jew. Because Jesus, after all, was a Jew, and he was the Jewish Messiah, they believed, and so since Jesus was a Jew, it made sense that if you were going to follow Jesus, you also needed to become a Jew. Well, we might say, well, what's the big deal? Just do it, jump through the hoops. But these were big hoops. You had to follow all 613 laws of that early church, which sort of organized your entire life. Laws about what you ate and what you didn't eat, what you wore, how you got your hair cut, especially laws about who you would associate and who you didn't associate with. And if you're a man, of course, there was that rule about having a little surgery. You had to be circumcised, and men, of course, were not lining up for this little procedure, right? So this was a big deal. They believed in that day, if you were going to be a good Christian, you had to first become Jewish. And this is what they had this slim definition of what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. It was this slim definition. And even Peter, as we're going to find out in the story for today, Peter, he was such a devout follower that he had never even been in the house of a non-Jew. He had never, ever even stepped foot in the house of a Gentile follower. This is how rigidly he followed every single law. Because if you went into someone's house, it made you unclean. And those Gentiles, those non-Jewish people, they were just dirty. They were repulsive, and you didn't go into their house. Well, in our story for today, God sort of has a come-to-Jesus moment with Peter. You know what I'm talking about, a come-to-Jesus moment? You know, it's like when your kids are screwing off, you have a little come to Jesus. That's what we call them in our house, right? He has this sort of intervention with Peter. And it comes in this really weird way. It comes through a dream. Peter's on vacation in a place called Joppa, and he has this vision. And it's a weird vision. It's this weird dream. So just bear with me here. He has this dream where there are all these animals. There are all these animals in his dream, and all the animals are animals that Jews were not to associate with. They were definitely not supposed to eat these animals. They were things like birds and reptiles. He has this really weird dream. And in the dream, he hears a voice. And it's the voice of God, and the voice of God is actually telling him, kill them, cook them, eat them. That's what the dream says. Kill them, cook them, and eat them. Raise your hand if you've had a weird dream before. Raise your hand. Come on, be honest, right? When I was a kid, I had this reoccurring dream that there was this giant that came through our neighborhood and threw pickles at us. Isn't that weird? Right? You know you've had a weird dream. He has this weird dream, right? It's to kill him, cook him, eat him. And of course, Peter, being this devout Jew, he said, there's no chance I'm going to do that. No way. You know, God, that I'm a devout Jew. I've never even touched non-kosher food. And that's when he hears the voice of God who says, Peter, it's okay. Peter, it's okay. He says it again, Peter, it's okay. Of course, Peter wakes up, and like all of us when we have weird dreams, he goes, what in the world was that about, right? I had a dream about a week ago that I had purchased a 1960s VW bus and was driving all over California with a guy I didn't even know, right? And I woke up, and it was a great dream, but I remember going, what is this all about, right? And I think Peter had the same experience. What is this about? A couple days later, Peter is invited to the home of a guy named Cornelius. You say Cornelius. That's just fun to say. Cornelius was an Italian guard. He was sort of a muckety-muck in the Italian military. He was not a Jew, and so you can imagine Peter was nervous about this. This is a Gentile's house. But Cornelius was a Christian. He was a devout Christian. The story says that he had told the story of God's love to all of his family, and they all worshiped Jesus. And he was known in his community for doing good deeds for people in need. He was a devout prayer. He was a Christian in every sense of the word. But I always imagine the story of Peter standing at his doorstep with all his buddies, his fellow Jews behind him, and his sort of knees knocking, and he's getting nervous, he's getting sweaty, because he's never been in the house of a Gentile. And this was a big, big deal in that day. I imagine him sort of like, guys, do you remember the first day you went to, in high school, when you went to a girl's house, and you were going to take her out on a date, and you just were terrified that her father was going to answer the door, right? And you had sweaty palms, right? I imagine he was nervous, standing there, waiting for Cornelius to come to the door. What am I going to do? And that's when Cornelius busts open the door, and he gives the most extravagant welcome to Peter. He gets down at his feet. His whole family's down at Peter's feet. They're saying, oh my Lord, he's here, Peter. You actually spent time with Jesus. We want to hear every single story you have to tell. He said, Peter, we got out the fine china. We even made those little finger sandwiches, and we got party wieners. It's going to be great. He was ready, right? And that's when Peter, standing there at the door, I imagine just nervous and frozen and not knowing what to do, he said, Cornelius, I don't want to come in. I don't want to come in. Cornelius, you know that we Jews don't do this. In the Bible, in the 10th chapter of Acts, it says, he said to them, you, Peter, is speaking to Cornelius, you are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with or visit I can't underemphasize how wrong this would have been in Peter's mind to show up at the home of Cornelius. It says, but God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure and unclean. That's sort of a backhanded compliment, right? He's standing there basically saying, all of you are repulsive and impure and unclean to me. But I imagine he sort of remembered that dream, that God had said, it's okay. And he sort of wondered if maybe there was a connection here. He said, but go back. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. And I imagine him thinking about that dream, going, maybe this is what it was all about. And then he said, let's keep going. Then Peter began to speak, and he said, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism. And I meant it. He couldn't even believe that he was saying what he was saying. Again, I can't underestimate how big a deal it was that he was there at a Gentile's house. You just didn't do that way back when. And I suppose we can't really blame them. And now I'm going to say something that might get me in trouble. But if you were to look around this room, I imagine there's someone in this room, if you were to have to spend the entire day with you, it would kill you, right? Let's be honest. In this room, come on, let's be honest. There are people in this room of different political persuasions, right? There are people with different personalities. There are people in this room of different proclivities, right? And now you're going, okay, which one would it be? Huh? Right? I mean, some of us have a hard time even spending a whole day with our families, let's be honest, right? For this was just crazy that he was there, and he's remembering this dream, and he's sort of figuring it out that maybe God was talking to him about this very situation. And he says, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism. Now let's go to the next slide. And then those who he had brought with him, his fellow Jews, they said, it says, the circumcised believers who had come with Peter, they were astonished that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on Gentiles. What is going on? And then Peter does something totally crazy. He says, surely no one can stand in the way of their being baptized with water. They have received the Holy Spirit just as we have. And that's when Peter ordered the entire family to be baptized. It's crazy. And they had this big party. Now, this may not sound like a big deal to you, but this launched the greatest controversy in the life of the early church that there ever was. This controversy was bigger than Meghan Markle's dad not coming to the royal wedding. Huh? This was bigger than when they changed the recipe of Coca-Cola. Anybody remember that? It was bigger than the Janet Jackson halftime show controversy, right? This was huge. Do those outsiders just get in? Do they just get in? I mean, do they have to follow the rules, or do they just... This is the biggest controversy in the early church. And when Peter went out and he was saying that, yeah, you could, Gentiles, you're welcome, the church exploded. It just exploded. It was unbelievable. And people like Paul and Barnabas, they went out and started these churches, and everybody in the city would come and be part of these new churches. But everywhere they went, there was this sort of split. Because everywhere they went, those faithful Jewish Christians, they felt like something of their life was being destroyed. Everywhere they went, the church was growing leaps and bounds, but everywhere there was sort of this split, because for those Jewish Christians, they just couldn't understand why the apostles weren't following the rules. And it even got ugly. Some of those Jewish Christians went after Paul, and they tracked him down, and they beat him up, nasty, almost killed him. And this whole controversy came to a big head when word got back to Jerusalem, the sort of the pinnacle of the church. Word got back there. And Jerusalem said, you guys, you got to start following the rules. You can't just let anybody into the church. And so to handle these matters, they called a great council of the church, where they gathered together all the church poobahs, and they gathered all the former disciples, the apostles, together in one place. And they had this big meeting where they were going to decide once and for all, do they just get in or not? And here's what we hear. It said, oh, that's hard to read. Can we fix that? Click the little button at the top. There we go. Good job, Sandy. Thank you. Yeah, round of applause for Sandy. Good work. Good work. Okay, it says, this brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. They didn't agree with those Jerusalem folks who were saying they got to follow the rules. So Barnabas and Paul were appointed, along with some of other believers, to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees, so this meeting had begun, and the Pharisees were the first to speak. They were the keepers of the law, and they stood up and they said, without any sort of tact, they basically said this: the Gentiles be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. It was black and white for them. Black and white. And this debate went on and on and on and on. And some of you are going, what's the big deal? Why did any of this matter? Just let them in already and get on with it. What's at stake? Well, here's what was at stake for those Jewish Christians. Their entire Bible was at stake. You see, for those Jewish Christians, their Bible was the Hebrew Bible. And that Bible was chock full of those 613 laws that they followed day in and day out. And it was filled with language about the prophets, and those prophets pointed back to the law. And this was their Bible back in there was no New Testament. And in order to just let those outsiders in, they needed to be willing to let go even of their Bible, of their specific version and interpretation of the Bible. In order to just let those outsiders in, they had to let go of their Bible. And so the debate went on, and as the debate got to the end, Peter got up again and he said, I've been where you've all been, you Jewish Christians. I've been there. I felt like you felt, but I've remembered. I remember that Jesus loved those Gentiles just like he loved us. He gave those outsiders the very same thing he gave to us. And that's when he says, when it comes to these laws, you know what's funny about them? We aren't even that good at following the laws. We stumble over them. Why would we put all these laws and requirements in front of those who are trying to come to faith? And then it said the apostles and the elders, they met together to consider this question. And the head of those elders and apostles was James, who is the brother of Jesus. And I always wonder what it was like to be James, the brother of Jesus. Have you ever wondered that? Like, do you imagine in junior high, like, Jesus goes, hey, I think I'm something special. I might be the Son of God. Right? And James looked at him and said, just shut up. Right? Imagine, if you're the brother of Jesus, it takes a lot to believe that he is the Son of God. It's pretty remarkable. So James gets up. He's the head of the church. And it says, when they finished, James spoke up. Brothers, he said, listen to me. It says, it is my judgment, therefore, after all this conversation, after all this debate, all this going back and forth, it's my judgment that we should... Okay, I'm going to have you read that again like you mean it. It is my judgment that we should not make it difficult for Gentiles who are turning to God. He said, we got to get over ourselves. All these barriers we put in the way of them coming to know Jesus, that God is for them, we got to get those barriers out of the way. We should simply ask them to do this. It says, instead, we should write to them, to these Gentiles, and ask them to just pay us some common courtesy as rule-following Jews. We should tell them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from meat of strangled animals, and from blood. Now, not only are those things just gross, right? But they were absolutely against some of the very, very strongly held beliefs of that Jewish community. This was not about following rules. This was about hospitality. You see, that early church, they decided that we should get everything out of the way, that we should make it absolutely not difficult at all for anyone who's trying to come to faith. That we should unhitch. They believed that they could unhitch their value system from their Bible, from their interpretation, their version of the Bible. This is wild. This is crazy. You're all looking at me like, what's the point, Pastor? You've been talking for 15 minutes. Come on. Pull out your card. Pull out your card. I want you to look at that name. Look at that name and read it to yourself. This is why this matters. What is it that has made it difficult for that person that you care about to know that God is for them? What's made it difficult for them to know that God is for them? What's gotten in the way of that? Because I think sometimes, whatever it is that we do as a church, sometimes we get in the way. I've got a couple of questions for you. And, oh no, I didn't put them up there. The first question is this. What barriers do we put in the way of those who are coming that want to know faith in Jesus Christ? What barriers do we as a church put in the way? And the second question is this. What are we willing to let go of so that that person on that card that we care about can come to know that God is for them? And maybe thirdly, what are we willing to embrace? What are we willing to embrace so that that person on your card might come to know that God is for them? I wonder. Someone once said to me,